in our conversation today, but that there are many dimensions of racism. And I want to share a personal story around one of my experiences. So as a child, I grew up all over in Africa, Egypt, Uganda, and the U.S., but my first 10 years was in Virginia, and we were like the only Black family, like for miles, like that. And in school, like I didn't even have any other Black friends. So the school insisted that they wanted to test myself and my brother for learning disabilities, and my mom disagreed and disallowed them to do that, but then they did it anyway, right? So that was an experience that I had in the context of the educational system, so that's systemic, and the institution of my school, so that's institutional, and the interpersonal experience I had with my teacher who was administering this test without my mother's permission. And then for me, the internalized oppression that then I had to unpack as I got older, and I look back on this experience and realized, that I thought that there was something wrong with me, and that was internalized and then associated with being really one of the only Black children in my school. And the foundation for that, like we said earlier in the history slides, is the ideology of white supremacy as being the basis of these systems that we interact with. So it exists on multiple dimensions. And so the killing of George Floyd has brought us to a catalytic moment and spurred this international uprising. But for Black families in America, this phenomenon has been ongoing and really hasn't stopped since slavery. And even since the tragic and violent murders and, dare I say, lynchings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, many other people, Black people, have already died in the hands of police, and the experience, the trauma and the experience of violence and death in the hands of an institution that's supposed to protect you. And some of those people are children. Some of those people are our children that have died and perished and by the hands of police. And not to mention, past victims that we know about, Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, another child. He was a child. I didn't let my son play with toy guns because I didn't know who was going to see that and think that he was dangerous. And as a mother of a Black son, I think about it every day. And so that is a form of trauma, knowing that my son's teenage behavior out in the world might be seen as violent, and there isn't anything I can do to really protect him from that. And then watching these videos, he saw it before I could even talk to him about it. But the videos themselves are incredibly traumatic. I mean, as necessary as they are, they're incredibly traumatic. And then for those of us that have had experiences with police, seeing this, like negative experiences with police, seeing these images are triggering. And so it's good to be in community to talk about this today. And I'm going to now pass it on to my colleague and dear friend, Rhiannon.
Hello. In my younger years, I suffered badly from a series of things like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, addiction, and an unhappy living situation while I was living with my dad and his girlfriend, my stepmonster. During that time, I experienced one of the most traumatic events that ever happened to me. In an argument with my stepmonster, one night, she called the police on me without me knowing. When I grabbed my keys to leave and get some air, 3 or 4 police cars pulled in front of my house. They asked, "Miss Diaz there?" When I opened the locking door, I was grabbed and pushed to the floor. Of course, I was screaming because it was the most terrifying thing to happen to me. And when when the cuffs on my hands were so tight and they got rough with me, I panicked. I just remember being face down with my head turned and what seemed to be a boot on the side of my head. Then they put me in a police car and drove me to the hospital, where they tried to take me into a hospital room with this doctor. I did everything I could, of course, not to go in the room because I was not told or even given any information of what they were going to do to me in there. And of course, the fact that I was paranoid schizophrenic, I did not want to go in a room that looked like a jail cell with no windows. When they gave up trying to get me into the room, they put me in the police car again and took me to the station. When we got there, I was afraid to get out of the car. Still, I was terrified. They were videotaping the whole thing, and again, although they were supposed to be the good guy, I could not understand why they were using so much force and why they were being so rough with me. Who was I going to have to protect me from them? When I wouldn't get out of the car because of sheer terror, a female police officer grabbed me by the legs and dragged me all the way from the other side of the back seat of the police car while I still had my cuffs on. At that moment, I had great terror that I was going to get my skull fractured or fall on my teeth while falling out of the police car and have them break on the cement. I had made a safe landing out of the police car, and 3 or 4 officers with two with rifles, and of course the cameraman were around me. They wrestled me and hogtied my feet to my hands behind me and carried me that way to an empty jail cell. While they were carrying me, I had urinated in my jeans, and my jeans slipped down. They left me standing in the jail cell with my pants soiled and down to my ankles, and my hands still handcuffed extremely tight. Again, frightened because they had male officers checking on me. With so many thoughts, I felt like they could come in and do anything to me and no one would ever know. They left me cuffed like that for around 2 or 3 hours. The next morning, I was released. All that for an overnight stay. They had taken me to the hospital again to be sure nothing broken or injured because I could barely move because my body hurt. Both my wrists and my hands were swelled and sprained and were the size of baseballs. Aside from that, I also had a lot of bruises. In this traumatic experience, I can't help but to think this could have been handled differently by a trained professional who was not defensive towards me. I was not a dangerous criminal, and I didn't have any weapon. At that time, I needed guidance and a way to head in a different path. I felt like when the police knew I had a mental disability and addiction, they, in sort, treated me as if I was not human anymore or like I wasn't going to remember this later. Although I was under the influence, I had never had a rough hand on me like that before, and it had bothered me for some time after that. Being that I'm a woman and a woman of color, I can't tell you just how much fear I had of being hurt like that again. I have nothing against the police, but a compassion and kind hand in understanding and guidance would have been much better than that traumatizing, tough love force. Today, I'm in supportive housing, and I have a little 1-bedroom to myself and my support animal. She's a weenie dog. I eat healthy and exercise to help with my mental condition. I'm in NA recovery, and I have been a success story for programs promoting reentry. The reentry programs and case managers have been a big stepping stone to my recovery from this trauma, and have drastically helped in the healing process. So I'd just like to go over my slide. So pretty much what would be great to have some police reform and having providers trained in crisis response to handle mental health cases, reform in crisis response so as to not cause trauma, and more funding for community providers and healers to provide ongoing public health services for community members.
Thank you so much, Ree, for sharing such a intimate experience and of your trauma, and so grateful to learn from your suggestions about how community can comport ourselves differently and how We can think about having crisis response, people that are trained in mental health crisis response to respond to calls so that folks don't experience more trauma in their experience of trauma, so that it's not compounding. And so we'd just like to welcome Lorraine to share with us her thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much, Rhiannon. You have a great gift of bringing us into the world of experience through storytelling, and it's powerful. And there's power in your story, and there's power in the reimagining of what can happen based on some clear action items that you've shared with us. So thank you. I myself, I'd like to give us an opportunity to take a look at how there are histories attached to the people that are seeking services. So back in the 1980s, I would tend to my dad's wounds after the police would drop him off, and they would say, keep him in for the night. There was an excusable way of saying, well, he's a gang member and a drug dealer, so what happens to him due to the hands of the police is not as serious as someone who is not involved in the gang or doesn't sell drugs. When my dad shares with me the story of how the police would strategically place him in a community to sell his drugs or to organize for the sake of their purpose, and then they would at some point just decide we want to keep him in for the night, and they would take his drugs and take his money, and they would beat him up real good, and they would drop him off at our house. In 1998, I experienced my brother being murdered, and still to this day, it's an unsolved case. The detective that was on his case was moved from his case after we found out that his best friend, who was murdered along with him, which was a white boy, his family was told information and said to not tell us anything, and they moved out of the neighborhood. This is the history. If providers knew history, if they had some idea of the history of those that they serve, then maybe they would be able to make a different decision on how they handle situations. 2 years ago, a 17-year-old Black male who's suffering from PTSD after being shot and don't know who shot him went to school. Prior to this day of going to school, this child, his parent, and the school staff sat down together for a safety planning, understanding that this child did not feel safe. The school staff would say, well, he's a good kid, and he's so smart, and he's always doing great things. We don't see why it's so hard for him. Until one day, he was found trying to commit suicide on campus. And the response of the staff at the school was to call the police, to have the police cuff him, place him in the back of their police car, and transport him to a psychiatric hospital. Based on extreme advocacy, a family member was able to pick this child up and transport him to the hospital. Had the staff put that safety plan into action, this advocacy would have not had to happen in that sort of way. That child would have been attended to by the safety plan people that were put into this idea of how we would keep this child safe. When we think about the community members and the ways that they could be trained in these responses, there are what they call CAT teams, community action teams. This is where they teach you how to go out as teams and do crisis response. They teach you how to do de-escalation. They teach you how to navigate crisis, how to respond to psychosocial crisis, how to recognize emotional suffering, how to do safety planning and interventions, how to create personal safety plans and crisis planning, and also spend time with just elaborating on your social supports. Now, there's a lot of talk about defunding the police. And so I'd like for folks to think about, when there's this conversation of defunding the police, how are we advocating for the reallocation of these dollars to support these communities of color, to support these community action teams, to support inclusive therapists, to support the work of advocacy? Remember, if it had not been for the advocacy, that boy would have not been okay with returning back to school after him being hospitalized in the psychiatric hospital. There could have been a lot more danger upon his life. If we as community, we as providers, if we employ our ability to be advocates, then we can also help in the solution to the healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for that powerful recommendations and for sharing with us your experience with your father and that story with that child. I think it really makes it real when we can use examples of how things should have been handled. And I think the crisis response teams is a wonderful way, I agree, to use money coming from the police to support community members and to support communities of color. And so I'll pass it on now back to Dr. Wendy.
So thank you both. Thank you all for your personal stories. I realize I don't have any personal stories. I want to start talking about things. I have stories too. I loved your comment, Lorraine, a couple seconds ago about the defunding of the police, because I think that sometimes when we're looking for solutions, and we're all looking for solutions, right? That we come up with sort of something specific, like defund the police or train the police. I'm participating in an initiative now, which is working towards training the police. And I have to tell you that the research shows that training alone does nothing to change people's behavior, nothing. Because whatever biases you have existed before that. And the systems that we have in place promote this kind of thinking. That's what Saba was talking about with that diagram, with oppression existing in all of those different perspectives, right? It exists on an individualized, internalized level. It exists on an interpersonal level, systemic level. So if we're gonna look at the problem as nuance, we have to also look at the solution as nuance, right? Because these systems in place really support them. This slide, this graphic really shows some of the more privileged identities versus those that are more marginalized and subordinated. And so, really what's funny about this world that we live in is that the privileged identities have nothing to do with what you really are. They have to do with what you look like. And the reality is a lot of these are invisible. So if you appear to be white, there are privileges that go along with that. If you are appearing to be male and masculine, there are privileges that go along with that. If you appear to be heterosexual, whatever that means, you are in an identity class that gives you more privilege. However, those with more marginalized identities, those that are queer, those that are trans, those that are people of color, those that are feminine, those that are undocumented, those that are older, are all folks that have a different task in life, right? That they have to prove themselves. They have to be credible. They are questioned in a different way, as Saba's example told us. What this means is that these are all things that contribute to racialized trauma. These are all stories that all of us have stories. We could sit here for the next 5 hours and talk about our stories with the police. I can tell you about how I was pulled over and put at gunpoint. Like, we all have these stories. And so those stories promote us responding in a couple of ways. For many of us, they promote our silence, right? They promote us being quiet because we know if we say anything, it's just going to be worse. And that silence is part of the reason why we're dying at higher rates than anybody else, because it's creating health conditions and mental health conditions that are not getting addressed. The other response is when we can't take it anymore, we engage in violence and then we're punished even harder. And so part of the challenge is not only while we're managing our communities and while we're managing our police and we're dealing with our mental health, it's also giving ourselves voice. Because those two positions, those binary positions, those polarized positions of silence and violence keep us from being heard, and they keep us silenced. And that's not what we want. That was it. That was a lot, I know.
Yes, it's definitely a lot. A whole lot.
So much.
So we just like to take a moment to ask you how you're feeling in your bodies right now. I know we talked about that at the beginning of the call, and we went through a lot in the first part of our session with the history, the violence, our personal experiences, that piece about how there's so much nuance in this. And it feels, it's heavy. And so we just want you to notice, and if you don't, if you don't notice any changes, there's nothing wrong with that either. But because trauma is physical, we just want you to sort of check back in with yourself and see what your body is doing. And as we start to move into discussing trauma in more depth and healing in more depth, we want to take a moment to practice together that reflection of what's happening in your heart, hands, and mind and body. And we also want to just take a moment to practice a meditation together. As I know, something I use on a daily basis to kind of manage being in this world as a Black woman. And so if you can, go ahead and get comfortable, get your feet grounded, and find the natural poise of your spine, which means your core might be slightly engaged. Relax your shoulders. And if you're able to, close your eyes and put your hand on your belly and your hand on your heart. And go ahead and take some breaths that expand your belly. And try taking a breath that expands both your belly and your chest. And go ahead and take another one and release it with sound. And then if you are able to keep your eyes closed, go ahead and point your eyes in the direction of the center of your forehead. And you can put your focus there, or you can simply just notice your breath. And slowly wiggle your toes. Stretch out your hands, open your palms wide. And come back to our virtual circle. Notice how you feel in your body now. And know that this is a practice that you can also do in community. I know we have lots of providers. Obviously, many of you have heard, and use this as a tool. But just want to remind you that this is a tool to manage racialized trauma and oppression as well. So, and it's very powerful done individually and extremely powerful. I think this is probably the biggest group I've meditated with in my life. So I have so much gratitude. Thank you so much. This is the experiential part of our webinar, and we might have some more. So I'll hand this one over back to Dr. Wendy.
It's so funny because one of the things, as we were preparing for this workshop, one of the things I was saying to the group is that when I tell my clients to engage in meditation, they always look at me as though I have like two heads, right? Like, who meditates? And one of the reasons why we wanted to build it in here is for the acknowledgement and the recognition of how powerful it is that you have the capacity moment by moment to calm yourself down. That is really important because we can't control the environment. We can't control the police. We can't control a lot of things. What we control is us. We can't control us. So the other thing I was going to say for this slide is that I don't know about you, but I learned as a little kid that I was not supposed to tell people that I was uncomfortable. And so if people said, "How are you?" I would say, "I'm great." And for a lot of people of color, there's this expectation that we are stoic. We're fine. We're good. And unfortunately, after a while, we're not always able to identify when we're not okay. So what we wanted to include in this slide, absolutely, Jessica, for Black women in particular, what this slide are some things to pay attention to. These are warning signs that you're getting tired, that you're fatigued, that you're not completely broken down, but you might be losing some traction. So if you can't shake grief that has been going on for a while, if you are super anxious, and by the way, we're in a quarantine and there's a lot going on, so you're gonna be anxious. So I'm wanting to normalize those things, but when you notice that you are not recovering, when you are not snapping back, there's not a level of resilience, when things aren't funny anymore, that's an emotional symptom, right? All of us, I don't know anybody who's not engaging in behavioral maladaptive coping skills right now. Like, I may have a glass of wine multiple days a week. Okay, I admit it. I may eat cake after every meal. But when you notice, again, right, we're talking about recovery. So if you are avoiding calling people back, if you are hiding from the people you love, you are isolating, those are behavioral symptoms. Okay, if you're having physical or physiological symptoms you've never seen before, headaches that occur more frequently, your heart not just goes up, but stays kind of at an elevated state, the racing of the heart, heartburn, stomach, GI issues, right? Those are physiological and physical symptoms. Most of us, the first thing that happens that we know something is wrong is we have cognitive symptoms. We get cynical, we get negative, we can't concentrate, right? Oh God, I can't remember anything. I keep forgetting where I put my keys. I keep forgetting to do this and that, right? Those are our cognitive symptoms. One of the biggest ones for helping professionals is to get caught up so much in our clients' lives that we think about them all the time and we don't even think about our own lives, right? And then the one that I think we talk about the least is the spiritual stuff, right? Not feeling hopeful. A lot of you talked about that in the chat, feeling hopeless, feeling disconnected, feeling purposeless. Those are spiritual symptoms. I don't care whether you believe in God or you believe in logic, you believe in love, you believe in nature. We all believe in something. And when you feel disconnected and purposeless, that is sort of the beginning of you losing your vitality. So all of these are warning signs, not only for you, but for the people you love, to recognize when you start to drag. You can go to the next slide. So I'll just jump into this, right? Because part of the reason why we put this slide again is because we started off talking about trauma and racialized trauma. And so we want to remind you, right, of the distinction that most of us, ACE's study, Kaiser study, told us that you can't get to adulthood without having experienced more likely multiple traumas. But what we're talking about with racialized trauma is the daily ongoing onslaught of managing racialized discrimination, harassment, bias experiences with those kind of traumas and the cumulative effect that that has on our overall mental and physical health. And that is kind of where we're starting so that we can begin to talk about what healing looks like. Next slide. So when we talk about healing racial trauma, I think sometimes mental health professionals think of things like, well, you just got to go to therapy. And I'm a believer that therapy is great for a lot of people, but it's not great for everyone. And to add nuance to that, therapy only works if there's a good fit. You have to trust the person that's across from you. You have to feel like they get you. There's a lot of pieces to the relationship that are important. But when we talk about healing racialized trauma in particular, there are many more elements that we want you to think about. One is that your brain is really important in this. And the brain, I don't even have time to go into all the details about why the brain is magical, but the brain stores trauma memories very differently and in a very different place than regular memories. So you have your memories of when you learned how to ride a bike and what happened this morning for breakfast. But trauma memories are stored somewhere else. So when you sit across from someone in therapy, you can effectively avoid all of that stuff because you have to have a different way of accessing it. It is not accessed through traditional, typical narrative recall. So what that means is that in order to really get at those places where the trauma lives, we need alternate interventions. Things like somatic therapies or EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Those are mental health treatments that directly impact the brain. We also know that trauma is stored in the body. So this can't be just a brain thing. I haven't heard of him, wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. I'll type it in the chat when I'm done with my section. But that book is amazing because it talks about how trauma shows up in our body. It shows up for us physiologically. It shows up in pain. It shows up in us holding our breath. It shows up in all sorts of places. So part of the healing for trauma means that you got to do stuff with your body. Right? So whether it's about your breathing, whether it's about you moving, whether it's about you doing yoga, like there's got to be a physical component to release some of this. Also, a lot of our traumas happen to our body. So they absolutely it has to be included in the process. The third bubble is about creativity. Someone asked about epigenetics. Wow. Okay, give me a second. Creativity is also important. And what we know about trauma is that a lot of those trauma memories live in the left brain, right? The left brain, the stories live in the left brain. The stories about the trauma live in the left brain. The way in which we often release those stories is through activation of the right brain. Okay, the right brain is where your artistic self lives, where your thank you, Saba, where your creative brain lives. All of that is the right brain. So doing things that aren't necessarily storytelling, or storytelling that is creative is a way to access the right brain. Finding ways to bring your creativity in, whether it's journaling or painting a picture. Again, not only left brain, but incorporating creativity. And the last way that the suggestion we have for healing racialized trauma is mindfulness. And we're going to talk about some resources in a little bit, but just the exercise that we did is an example of how you slowing yourself down, how you soothing yourself, how you regulating something as simple as you eating regularly, sleeping a regular amount of time can be mindfulness practices, grounding your thinking that keep you from spiraling or falling down that rabbit hole. Somebody asked about epigenetics, and we don't have the time to go into as much detail about that. But, Joy DeGruy has written she wrote the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And one of the things she talks about in that book is how Black people in particular are carrying epigenetics that come from slavery. There's been some great research that talks about how, like, for example, Jewish folks carry Holocaust trauma stuff. We absolutely carry slavery stuff. So now the conversation comes into, you're not just dealing with what you see on the police about George Floyd, but you're dealing with all of that ancestor trauma that occurred before you. And that indeed is very heavy. You can go to the next slide. So for me, clinically, this means, and I think this is information for, let me back up. So one of the questions in the chat was, how do we heal racial trauma while it's happening? One of the things that we need to recognize is that we cannot control external elements. We are working really hard through forums like this to talk about how we can consciously come to a community and create changes, right? As a community, we can make policy changes, we can make advocacy changes, we can make on the ground changes. But while that is happening, you have got to find a way to manage your own reaction so that you are not spiraling, okay? Many of you talked about feeling heavy and feeling tired. We have been dealing with this our whole lives, right? This didn't start with George Floyd. This has been going on for years. So one of the best ways to start healing is to take care of you. This means acknowledging that no, you're not okay. This means acknowledging that you need some help. This means being willing and courageous enough to implement some new techniques so that you can take care of you. So some of these warning signs are things to pay attention to. And so if this means that you pick one or two things that you are willing to try, those go a long way towards healing. So do some yoga, right? Be willing to, I ordered these paint by numbers kits off Amazon. Let me tell you, it sounds corny, but that thing has changed my life. I'm over there focusing for 3 hours on some stupid little number. It impacts my right brain, right? I do meditation. There is a site, what's it called? Insight Timer. Have you all heard of that? Have you all heard, Saba, have you heard of this? Insight Timer? Right?
Is that an app?
It's an app. It has sound bath on it. It has spiritual healing stuff on it. Like, there are a lot of opportunities out here that we can utilize, but we have to be willing to do something different. And so part of this this slide here is about helping providers shift their climate, right? If you are going to provide, there's a free version too, by the way, let me say about that, because I am always down to a free version of an app and to not buy it and to get it for free. So that's a worthwhile investment. But providers, we are really learning these days to take a trauma-informed perspective. What we are encouraging you to do is combine that trauma-informed perspective with a critically conscious lens, right? So those same 5 categories of safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, which are important for trauma-informed treatment, can also be applied using a critically racially conscious lens, right? So that we're thinking with every client that comes in that they have a story, that they have identities that we can't necessarily identify from looking at them. So we got to be interested in them, right? And then we're always talking about how people can be safe, because Rhiannon and Larae and Saba's stories all tell us that everybody has history that they're not necessarily talking about. They have history that make them feel unsafe, right? And that everyone has traumas that have had an impact on them. When we talk about choice, almost every experience of racism or discrimination is one where the person who was targeted did not have any options, right? And trauma does the same thing. So recognize that people need in provider therapeutic context to have choices. Even if they're little choices, even if somebody has to be hospitalized, right? If I have to, Rhiannon's story was great. If I have to hospitalize you, I'm at least going to give you the integrity of, if I can, of bringing your pillow, of bringing your pajamas, right? I'm going to give you a choice so that you are not without any consent, right? Collaboration is another piece, right? We want to always collaborate, not only with our clients about who they are and what their cultural and spiritual needs and norms are, but we got to know who they are to have a real rapport. We also want to collaborate with all their other treatment providers. And if you really want people to be involved in the work you're doing, you have to give them a space to be honest about how they're experiencing you. Okay, I say that, and I want to pause with that one, because if you say to somebody, do you like the work I'm doing? Is it helpful? They're always going to say yes, especially if you have more mainstream identities and they don't. But if you consistently inquire about how culturally relevant the work is that you're doing, people will be honest with you over time. You just got to give them some space. Similarly, trustworthiness is important, not only with trauma, but also with racial backgrounds. And when there is a boundary violations, I could do a 4-hour training on alone, right? One of the things that people of mainstream identity get mad about are time violations, right? Well, you're late. You must not want it. You know, we have a policy that says we're going to cancel you if you're late more than 3 times. What if that person is trans and they can't use the regular bathrooms because they might get harmed or killed? So they have to hold their urine or go to specific places around town and can't get to you on time. What if they have to take 4 buses to get to you? Like, recognize the boundary violations for people of mainstream or privileged identities are not the same for people that have marginalized status. So be aware that that is an issue. And the final area, as I've been talking about on an ongoing basis, is that empowerment is important. We need to be seen, and we need to be affirmed, and we need to be validated. And until you ask us who we are, you won't be able to do that, right? So people need to tell their stories. And without inquiring about that, you're not going to have the information that you need. So keep in mind, right? These are 2 pieces to consider, not separate, but together: racially conscious and trauma informed. Next slide, please. Yeah, Insight Timer rocks. I'm trying to tell you, this is a gem right here. So I've been talking for a while about self-soothing and coping. And I just want to clarify that this is your power. This is your power right here. You cannot stop anybody from doing what they're doing. What you can do is you can take care of you. And I have to tell you, I see people of color all day long who refuse to do this. We are all waiting for some mother, some external figure. We're waiting for a spiritual guide. We're waiting for somebody to take care of us. And the truth is that they may also be there, but you got to do it too, right? So one of the ways that you can soothe yourself is you can draw a line of demarcation in your own experience between your own traumas, your old past traumas, and your current traumas. What happens for most of us is this thing happens and it lights up the pathway to all the other traumas. See, this means I'm a terrible person. See, this means nobody loves me. See, this means I'm responsible. See, that is the beginning of the end for all of us. So you got to be able to engage in some self-talk that says, this is not reflective of all these other things. This is what's happening right now. While there are similarities, while my brain is responding to all of that, this current situation is not all of those same stories. Because what happens is when your brain responds to trauma, it goes right to the sympathetic nervous system, right? It goes right into survival. It goes right into fight, flight, freeze. And when that happens, any access to your thinking, yourself, your voice, your resources all goes away. So until you soothe yourself, you're not going to be in the right headspace to take care of yourself or anybody else. Okay? Take a look at your coping strategies. Do they work? That extra piece of cake is delightful every night and every day and during the day, but it is not helping me. It's making me inflamed. It makes me feel crappy about myself. I can't wear a bathing suit. I hate myself when I eat cake every day. So it's not an adaptive coping skill that's helpful. Okay, it's not. Be honest when you assess what your skills are. And if they're not, and by the way, it is working in the moment. There is nothing I can control every day except what cake I eat. So that does give me a sense of power. So you got to be honest about what's working about your tools and what's not. And at what point do you get concerned? What point do I say this is enough and I need to do something else? Right? Those are critical questions you can ask yourself about your soothing and your coping skills so you can employ some alternate methods. Next slide. I talked a little bit about grounding. Grounding is one of the ways that you can self-soothe and engage in mindfulness. And here are some really basic ways that you can ground yourself. Grounding is not the answer, okay? It's not going to fix anything. What it's going to do, it's going to anchor you. I'm guessing that some of you might be anxious. Yes? Is anybody possibly anxious in this audience? Okay, so even our panelists are anxious. Thank you. So those of you that are anxious, spiral. You know what I'm talking about? Spiraling, where you either go into the universe or you go in the rabbit hole, right? That's what happens when you're anxious. What grounding does is it anchors you to the ground so you stop the spiral. You got to catch it early, okay? If you wait till you're in the bottom of the hole or at the top of the stratosphere, you're not going to be helpful to yourself. But there are things you can do. And this is, you're at home probably, so you can do this, right? Lay on the ground. Take your shoes off. You're probably not wearing shoes anyway. I don't wear shoes anymore. Put your feet on the floor, right? Squeeze some Play-Doh, right? Go put something on that feels good. Make some tea. Use some essential oils. Take a bath. Light a candle. One of the things that you can do to cognitively ground is you can name like 5 things in the room. Lamp, light, like yellow table. Like you can name them and that grounds. If you have to describe them, that's a way to do it. Breathing is one of the most, as Saba was demonstrating, is one of the most powerful tools you can use, and distracting, of course. So these are all things you can do to ground yourself. And if I were you, I would pick one and try it and see if it works. If it doesn't, pick another one and see if it works. Something is going to help you. All we're looking for is you to stop spiraling. Okay, if you can do that, you can stay in your body and you can stay in your mind so that you can respond rather than react. Okay, reactivity is never helpful. Responsiveness is thoughtful and gives you room to make good decisions. Next slide. These are some recommendations for mindfulness. I included some belly breathing, I included some box breathing, I included some progressive muscle relaxation. I didn't include any prayers, but prayer is also a way to be mindful. I included some meditations, some doing nothing for 2 minutes, and some yoga. You're welcome to find these on your own, but I just wanted to give you a place to start because we all need some tools. Your job is to develop a toolkit so you can get yourself there. And we're going to make this available to all of you at the end of the training. Yes, you'll get the links.
So powerful. I mean, I think a lot of times we talk about self-care, but we don't talk about it in the context of actually specific practices that look like self-care, but they're actually healing our trauma and our anxiety. And so I really appreciate just that specificity around, because I feel like if you talk about it in self-care, it's like, oh, I can put that off. Like, oh, self-care, yeah. That it's that thing that people say is important. But if you think about it as like, I am healing my anxiety and trauma by taking this activity. And I just wanted to share with the group, this is my grounding tool. It's a crystal. It's a rainbow moonstone. And when I'm sitting on calls and when I'm, on the phone or on a webinar, I have it, and it's a grounding tool for me that I use quite often. And another tool that resonated with me and sounded similar to a practice that I do. So that piece that Dr. Wendy was saying, just name like the yellow vase and like name things that are around you to ground yourself. A lot of times if I'm feeling anxiety, I just say out loud, I'm feeling anxiety. And it's amazing how much just saying it out loud will allow yourself some space and grounding. And so in that vein, I just want to share some more practices. This is from Dr. Tima Bryant-Davis, another clinician that talks about that intersection of trauma-informed care and critical race theory in the context of complex trauma of oppression. And I just, a lot of these practices, like I'm also thinking about like ancestral practices that we have in our lineage. I like say dance. And, you know, it's like, oh, that's cultural. That's a thing of this, my culture. But it's actually a healing. It's a way of healing, and it's a way of being in community together and using our universal commonalities as human beings. And so it's therapy, and it's freeing. And so go ahead. Like Dr. Wendy said, you know, you're not wearing shoes anyway. No, you're at home. Go ahead and turn up the music and have yourself a dance party and say, oh, well, yeah, I took care of my mental health today. Or, you know, go ahead and sing that song and loud at the top of your lungs, you know, and enjoy it, because you know what? You're also breathing when you sing. And that's extremely healing as well. And what I love about these practices that she lists is that they're ones that you can do with other people. So many of the providers that we have on the call, I think I saw a question around like, what are some practices that we can take? These are some practices you can take with your clients, with your tenants, and with your family, and with your community. So, and they're, like I said earlier about our meditation, it's super restorative and healing to do it on my own, and it's a different kind of restoration and healing when I do it in community, as we did together. And these things are fun, and so having fun is just so vital to our well-being. And I want us to take a moment with our last few minutes to practice one of the things that's listed here around art-based activities. So, you know, a lot of us, I think culturally or maybe white supremacy might say that art is extraneous. Even though we do have quite a number of cultural art institutions, I know for me, when I go to look at classic art, like I get annoyed because I don't see people that look like me. But there are so many forms of art that can be healing to us. And like Dr. Wendy said, you know, those little color by number things are huge. But I want us to play with the art of poetry. Oh, and laughter. Thank you for naming that. That's also a meditation, a laughter meditation that you can do. Just laugh for 1 minute. In fact, Lorraine led us in a meditation like that the other day. So, but let's practice this poetry exercise. So, if I was a color, my spirit would be. So, if anyone wants to enter the end of that poem, and maybe Emma, if you can type that in for me. Oh, someone said yellow already. If I was a color, my spirit would be what and why? Or if I was an animal, I would be what and why? So I see here, purple, blue, green. Ooh, all of a sudden I see those images. If I was a color, my spirit would be mint, hot pink, peanut butter. See, I'm even making a poem just reading you guys' beautiful comments. Red is joyful. Oh, a lion because I'm fierce. Oh, giraffe. Like suddenly I'm in the jungle. So that thing of engaging your imagination is just such a freeing practice that we have available to us at all times. And it's just so beautiful. And so I just want to credit Dr. Tima Davis for that little activity on poetry. But, oh, a red-headed finch, you don't think about that kind of a bird very much. But there are many different ways you can practice these things. So, and you can play, and you can even in community say, okay, well, we're going to choose one of these today. Someone like come up with dance for us to learn. And so play is also just that playfulness, and playing with each other engages that part of your brain and allows you some relief. And so I just wanted to note, I can't say enough, like Dr. Wendy, like, will you please run for president? Like, we just love you. Thank you for, I mean, just especially that intersection around trauma and racial trauma and trauma-informed care. That intersection of critical race theory and trauma-informed care is so magical and golden and brilliant. And we just really appreciate your work so much in this space. And I just wanted to highlight for all of us, yes, see, we have some agreement, Dr. Wendy for president. It's starting.
Maybe I'll be Kanye.
Right? You could be our next Kanye. I mean,
Please,
I might
not that.
I mean,
I'm not
sorry,
ready for that.
no.
That's right. Give me some prayers,
So
Brianna. I like that.
it is. It's good to kind of laugh. I see some laughter happening. So this is our healing too. But I encourage you to read up on Dr. Wendy Ashley's publications. This voice and you know, this perspective is what we really need to spread in the work. And this perspective around healing and the practices that we've covered today, I'm just so excited that we could share that together so that it really goes out into our communities. And this is a national platform. So, and many people are asking, will these slides be available? Yes, we will make them available to you. And so I just want to pass this slide to Ms. Diaz, one of her favorites.
As we close out this webinar, I'd like to send you off with a little prayer. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live your life with ease. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ree. And actually, hey, we have a couple.
We did it.
We do have some time, Wendy. We were like, we're not going to have time. We have time for questions, everyone. So don't hang up yet. Look at all the thank yous and the hugs and kisses. We love that. We feel it. And thank you so much for that beautiful energy. But so do folks have questions? I'm looking for them.
I have a few, Saba, that I saved from the chat.
Great.
This one is
Thank you,
from Rebecca Stitch, and she asked earlier, on a policy level, one wonders how we can make clear when someone calls to get help for someone in crisis that the right team is sent. As a general community member, I might know that a person is clearly having a mental health problem, but see that they need help. So who do I call to get them that help? And I think this was referring to the idea that the police might not be the best people to respond to a mental health crisis.
That's a terrific question. Wendy, do you want to start with our response, or?
Go ahead. I'll jump in. Go ahead. I'll jump in.
I think that's part of the issue that I think we as a society. It's like 911 is called for everything, and we don't even know who our local mental health providers are. And in fact, people working in that space have the salaries for those positions. You know, some of the work that folks do in crisis response in terms of homelessness, those positions are really tough. People burn out and they don't get paid well enough. So I think we need to amplify those professions as a response to crises versus the police. And until that happens, we need to kind of get to know who those community organizations are and how we can support them too. And maybe start with making investments in our local mental health community organizations. So that they can have the capacity to respond like a 911 service would. And so I know from a policy perspective, we need to really advocate for policies that will allow for that. And I think the Defund the Police movement is a really powerful moment for us to advocate for those agencies to be bolstered economically, for the money to come directly from the budgets, because a lot of the police officers don't want to do that work. They're not qualified to do that work, and it's like so much is thrown to them. So from a policy perspective, we just really need to advocate that those monies get invested into community mental health organizations. And until then, we need to get to know our communities. And we need to get to know those organizations and find out how we can support them.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about are sort of two different objectives. There's a short-term objective and a longer-term objective, right? The
Mhm.
longer-term objective is to create these systems where we don't have them. A lot of people are responding in the chat that there is like a 998 or 988 in New York, and there's a 311 in Chicago. And so we don't have that yet. I mean, there's like 211, but that's not like
There's
anybody.
a 211. Yeah.
But I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, so in the meantime, Saba's recommendation is valid. Like we need to find out who in each of our communities is offering this kind of intervention. And then the other part is that there are all sorts of grants and there's funding being offered. This is a great time to get some money to establish something like this. So if your agency and your organization has the capacity to initiate something like that, take a look at what they're doing in New York. Take a look at what they're doing in Portland. Take a look at what they're doing in Missouri, and build something for us. Because we can use what we have in the meantime, but we absolutely need to have a different system in the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Emma, do you have another question for us, or should we?
I do. Yeah, there's
Okay.
a question here. How can staff mitigate the lack of awareness of colleagues surrounding racial trauma when their perspectives are so entrenched in the institutionally racist perspective? What can you do in your job? I think is specifically what the question's asking about.
Can I start?
Yeah, go
I'm gonna
ahead.
stick my foot all the way in this one. So there is a huge difference between not being a racist and being anti-racist. Okay, those are very different positions. So you could be someone who's, not racist and loves everybody and has an ideology that's loving, but if you're going to take an anti-racist position, you got to be ready to confront this stuff. Like that positioning, and none of us want to do that. We're all terrified of how we're going to get beaten up and fired and killed and ostracized. But the truth is that it means noticing the jokes about that borderline patient or that, that violent Black woman. Like that's us busting those stereotypes. That's us confronting the systemic racism. That's us asking questions. My belief is that your biggest empowerment is to be curious. Watch your tone, be curious. I wonder if that's about her behavior or if there's an element about that comes from systemic racism. Pause. Right? We got to learn how to do this. We got to learn how to do this. Curiosity. That's right, Jerry. Compassionate curiosity. Yes, Jewel. If you bought Kendrick, what's his name? Who wrote the book How to Be How to Be Anti-Racist? Rocks.
Kendi.
Those are what's his name? What's his name again?
Kendi.
Yes, Kendi.
Ibram X.
Yes, mm-hmm. Those are great resources that are going to help you find the language and the skills to be able to confront this tiny bit by tiny bit. Sorry, go ahead, Saba.
Mm-hmm. No, that's such a great question, and I know that oftentimes like staff of color are seeing things and experiencing things, and it feels like it takes a lot of bravery to navigate that and manage your own racial trauma. Yes. But I think that to the extent that, you can really bring yourself to the work and first off thinking about your comfortability, but to the extent that you can share some experiences with colleagues. I know in my organization at our staff meeting, we are now talking about race. We're talking about it in the context of our work, but we're also building a lot of trust to be able to kind of share some of our experiences, especially as staff, those of us that are staff of color. And by sharing stories, that's really a way to engage people in understanding. I mean, I feel like storytelling is like one of our fundamental, people have been telling stories since we were sitting by fires. And so that's really always an available way to engage people. And Rhiannon and Lorraine, the way they storytell, it just like puts you in a different headspace where you can really start to kind of observe and experience and make these connections. And so I think storytelling is really powerful. And to the extent that you can advocate for more education around this issue in the context of your work is really,
Yes.
really excellent. Like, that's a really important entry point. There's so many resources out there to be able to do that. And whether it be training, whether it be like required reading, just advocating in your organization to really look at this from an academic standpoint is another way to really start to unpack how that applies to your culture and how then that can apply to the culture of the organization and the experiences of the tenants, and just expanding that consciousness that we talked about at the beginning of of our time together. Any opportunities to do that, I think, through either education or through storytelling are always welcome. And look, we only have 1 more minute. Do we have time for one more question?
Can I add something
go ahead,
to that?
Dr. Wendy.
That,
Yes,
well,
please.
I just wanted to go back to what we did at the beginning, which is where we asked people where they were at. And a lot of people said they were feeling heavy and they were feeling, and I hear this from every client of color that I have, that they are very fatigued with all the weight of what's happening right now. And I say all that because I do think we have a responsibility to say something when we see these things happening, but people of color cannot be the only ones to carry this. Every social movement, every social justice movement has allies. And so this is a good time to collaborate with our allies, our white-bodied allies, our male-bodied allies, to let them carry some of this. And there's enough folks out there that can help share the load so that we're not all doing it alone.
That's so beautiful and such an important point to end on, and especially in this virtual circle we have, to think about our colleagues, our community, and that we're not carrying this alone. This is something that we all have to participate in, and that we have people to support us. So I just can't tell you how appreciative I am of being with Ray, Wendy, Rhiannon, and all of you today on this journey that we've had really together. And I feel like I've been on a journey, and really appreciate all the beautiful questions. And we will maintain contact in terms of responding to any questions we didn't get to. And be well, people. Be well, our friends. We really appreciate you. And if you will take tell us how we did. And I think, Emma, is that going to be a survey that they get?
It's in the chat.
Yep, I put the link in the chat. So we just love to hear your feedback. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being who you are in the world. And thank you for sharing time in this really important topic. Any last goodbyes from the other panelists, my esteemed panelists? Oh, thank you. That was a sweet wave from Rhiannon. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful, beautiful day. Thank you again.
Bye, family.
Bye, family.
Do you still need to stay on?
I'm reading all the comments.
They're really good. Do you all need me to stay, or can I?
No, go ahead, Dr. Ashley. We appreciate you so much. You have you did a lot for the whole nation right now. We're
Not the nation.
Who
knew I had a presidential campaign?
National audience. See, I'm picking you up. I'm getting you used to it.
You better stop it right now. Stop it.
Okay, I'll stop.
I'm not ready for that kind of recognition.
I can't help it. It just came to me naturally.
For president.
I will receive that love. I will receive it. I think we did a great job. I think we did a really nice job.
So we did a great job together. Oh, love you so much. Love you guys so much.